The Hamas terror orgy of October 7th, 2023 took place about 410 days ago. My memories of that nightmare are surrealistic. It was on a Shabbat that was also the holiday of Shmini Atzeret. My wife and I were visiting with friends in a different part of the city, and in the synagogue, on the morning of that Shabbat, I overheard some furtive whispering about something that had happened in Israel. Because it was Shabbat and a holiday, people were not using their phones. But some people heard something somewhere and somehow. All we seemed to know at that point was that there had been some kind of terrorist attack in Israel, which is not really news, but this seemed to be a little bit different. Being off the grid and without access to clear information was extremely frustrating. And it wasn't going to get better soon, because the next day was also the holiday of Simchat Torah, when phones were not going to be used. The next morning, there was increased chatter going on at the synagogue as more information was slowly seeping into our electronically sealed world. The reports were conflicting, but it seemed that there were dozens of people killed in southern Israel and a number of people taken hostage back to Gaza. We were horrified, but had absolutely no idea of what actually happened and how terrible the situation actually was. Like someone drowning and gasping for air, we felt desperate to have access to clear information. On Sunday night, when the holiday ended, I had to pick up my wife, who had walked a few kilometers to visit some other friends that afternoon. And as soon as I got into my car, I anxiously turned on the radio. Incredibly, there was no report on what had happened in Israel during their 5-minute news recap. The only thing I heard that was relevant was about a large demonstration of hundreds of people in downtown Montreal expressing their support for the resistance in Palestine. I was in total shock. When I arrived at where my wife was, they had learned that the attack was far worse than we had thought. But they still did not know the full extent of the tragedy. It turned out that the Montreal protesters were not alone. On October 7th itself, just hours after Hamas's surprise attack that murdered over 1,200 people and kidnapped 251 back to Gaza, the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America organized a rally in Times Square before any Israeli counterattack on Gaza. They demanded an end to all U.S. aid to Israel. They shouted, "Free Palestine." They burned Israeli flags, and one protester held up her phone with an image of a Nazi swastika. And there were other such protests in different cities throughout the world. While Israeli bodies were still warm, and long before the Israeli Defense Forces invaded Gaza, demonstrations and protests erupted all over the world that were not so much for the cause of Palestinian rights, but were rather a perverse spasm of hatred toward the state of Israel and toward Jewish people. The Green Party vice presidential candidate in the recent U.S. election, Rudolph Ware, celebrated the October 7th massacre. A week after the Hamas onslaught that saw the greatest loss of Jewish life on one day since the Holocaust, a Cornell University professor speaking at a campus rally said that the attack was exhilarating and energizing. A professor at the School of Art Institute of Chicago posted on Instagram that the Israelis are pigs, savages, very bad people, irredeemable excrement. At Columbia University, a tenured professor posted an article online describing the Hamas attack as an innovative major achievement and a source of jubilation and awe. Shortly after Hamas's brutal pogrom, 31 student organizations at Harvard University issued a statement insisting that Israel is the only one to blame for all of the violence. The extent of Western support for Hamas after October 7th was shocking, especially among young people. In December 2023, a Harvard-Harris poll found that 60% of Americans aged 18 to 24 believed that Hamas's attack was justified. 50% said they sided with Hamas against Israel, and 51% favored a one-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, where the Jewish state would be brought to an end and handed over to Hamas and the Palestinians. One of the most grotesque and disturbing elements of the moral perversion following October 7th was the frenzied tearing down of hostage posters of people who had been kidnapped during the attack and taken to Gaza. In New York, the photo of a 12-year-old kidnapped victim was smeared with feces. In London, the faces of the 3-year-old Israeli twins who were kidnapped on October 7th were daubed with Hitler mustaches. During the year 2024, university campuses across North America became hotbeds of solidarity with Hamas and intimidation of Jewish students. The world was shocked when the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania appeared before the House Committee on Education and the Workforce and were asked if calling for the destruction of Israel and the genocide of Jews constituted harassment and violated the regulations at their universities. None of these presidents was able to give a clear and forthright answer. The president of MIT replied that whether to define this kind of language as harassment depended on the context. Bernard Levy, in his book Israel Alone, points out that these 3 universities appear at the bottom of the free speech rankings compiled each year by the Nonpartisan Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It would seem from this that all minorities on campus are protected against offensive comments. Safe spaces and comfort zones are provided so students are not disturbed by hurtful speech. That is, all students and all minorities but one. We must not forget something else about the non-stop agitation to vilify, isolate, and delegitimize Israel since October 7th. The character assassination of Israel and support for terror that invaded universities and TikTok metastasized into skyrocketing anti-Semitism and attacks on Jewish people worldwide. In the weeks after October 7th, anti-Semitic hate crimes in London rose by 1,350% compared with the same period in 2022. In the United States, anti-Semitic attacks rose by 400%. In Germany, by 240%. And here in Canada, by 670%. We should not forget that the current conflict between Israel and Hamas operating out of Gaza is not the first such conflict. Israel unilaterally and totally left Gaza in 2005. Every soldier left, and over 9,000 Israeli citizens living there in 25 settlements were evicted from Gaza. Even the bodies of Israelis buried in Gaza were exhumed and transferred to burial plots in Israel proper. The Palestinians living there immediately destroyed all of the greenhouses that were left behind by the Israelis. And in 2006, the following year, they voted Hamas into power. Gaza received billions of dollars in international aid. But instead of using the funds to build schools and hospitals and infrastructure, Hamas absconded with the money and used it to construct massive terror tunnels larger than the New York City subway system and turned Gaza into an armed terrorist camp. Since then, Israel has battled with Hamas 4 times prior to October 2023. They first fought in the year 2008 to 2009, then in 2012, and then in 2014, and then in 2021. Each of these conflicts unfolded in the exact same way. They began with Hamas and other terror groups in Gaza, like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, launching hundreds of rockets at civilian targets in southern Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces would respond by bombing terror bases and infrastructure in Gaza, and with Israeli troops entering there in 2014. The Hamas playbook has been the same in each conflict, including the present one. They would place their rocket launchers, store their weapons, and station their fighters in and near schools, hospitals, and residential buildings. They believed that employing this tactic of using human shields was a win-win situation for them. Either Israel would refrain from counterattacking, and they could continue striking Israel with impunity, or they would purposely cause their own civilian casualties if Israel responded to their attacks. And this was intended to generate worldwide protests against Israel, who would then be pressured by the international community and the United States to halt their counterattacks. Because Hamas knows that generating international pressure and outrage against Israel is their most powerful weapon, they invest heavily in promoting it, in promoting the death and injuries of their own citizens. Hamas and their supporters believe that by marshaling international outrage against Israel, not only will it hamper Israel from being able to defend itself against terrorist attacks, but it will generally isolate and weaken Israel politically and economically. In addition to their terrorist attacks against Israel, this effectively opens up a second front in their war to destroy the Jewish state. This full-court press that sees Israel as the worst nation on the planet and accuses it relentlessly of the most obscene behavior has been going on for decades. For now, let's just look at two examples. In 2001, the United Nations organized a World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. Ultimately, the conference did not deal with the numerous forms of racism and intolerance throughout the world. For example, the Taliban had just recently blown up ancient Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. Not a word. Instead, the entire conference was an ambush of Israel, Zionism, Jews, and Judaism, according to Rabbi Abraham Cooper, a delegate to the conference from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Outside the conference, there were over 20,000 anti-Israel protesters, some holding up a large banner saying, "Hitler was right." The proceedings were so dramatically biased that the American delegation pulled out. The final document produced by the conference singled out only the Israel-Palestine issue for comment. And their comment and discussion was thoroughly one-sided. They threw the book at Israel for subjecting Palestinians to everything from apartheid to genocide, and basically called for the dismantling of the Jewish state. There was absolutely no discussion of terrorist attacks on Israeli citizens by Palestinians. As we say in Hebrew, "Ze lo ba b'cheshbon." It was not seen as relevant. While Israel was demonized and seen as the ultimate enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil in the world, radical Islamic fundamentalist groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda escaped censure. Ironically, 3 days after the Durban conference ended, Al-Qaeda murdered 3,000 people on September 11th when they attacked the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The legacy of Durban was that it was the genesis of the Israel apartheid campaign, which led to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. BDS, as it's known, is an international campaign to delegitimize and apply pressure on Israel through diplomatic, financial, professional, academic, and cultural isolation of the State of Israel, Israeli individuals, Israeli institutions, and Jews who support Israel's right to exist. Their strategy assumes that the same boycott and isolation tactics that led to the dismantling of the South African white minority government will also put an end to the independent Jewish state of Israel. It's important to understand that the BDS movement is not seeking reconciliation between Israel and Palestine. Instead, BDS strives to dehumanize Israelis and portray Israel as a pariah state that has no right to exist. While some proponents of BDS claim to only target Jewish settlements across the Green Line, this distinction is lost on the vast majority of people, and the effect of the movement as a whole has been to demonize and destroy the entire state of Israel. Of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict is extremely complex. The great lie of BDS is to place 100% of the blame on Israel and totally ignoring any role that Palestinians might be playing in the strife. BDS has even attracted many Jewish supporters because they often focus their rhetoric as an effort to address the plight of Palestinians. Palestinians living under a so-called Israeli occupation. And BDS is able to co-opt people committed to human rights concerns. But this is a deceptive subterfuge. The agenda of BDS is not to improve the lives of Palestinian Arabs. Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, said, quote, "We oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine." Assad Abukal, a BDS activist, clarified, saying, quote, "The real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel. This should be stated as unambiguously as possible." And Lara Kiswani, another BDS activist, said, quote, "The end-all of BDS is to weaken Israel, to isolate Israel, and to give the global community a role in the liberation of Palestine, all of occupied Palestine, from Haifa to Jerusalem to Ramallah." It's important to realize that this anti-Israel agitation is not simply the product of social justice activists in the 21st century. The sordid origins of these campaigns actually began 35 years earlier, in the mid-1960s. Between 1964 and 1965, the UN Commission on Human Rights sponsored the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The Soviet Union balked at condemning anti-Semitism because they were knee-deep in it. Since the early 1900s, at that time, in the early 1900s, the Tsarist security services were behind the fabrication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery that has been used for decades to malign and slander the Jewish people. In the 1920s, Stalin employed anti-Semitism to consolidate his power. In the 1930s, he sought to eliminate Jewish influence from all spheres of Soviet society. The Soviet security apparatus sought to portray Jews as traitors and Western spies. In the 1960s, the KGB implemented anti-Jewish policies. This included religious persecution where Jews could not publicly practice their religion. There were restrictions on immigration out of the Soviet Union for Jews. The government spread anti-Semitic propaganda regularly, and Jews faced institutional racism in many areas of the government. Because the Soviet Union was reluctant to go along with the UN's plan to condemn anti-Semitism, they came up with the idea of obfuscating the issue by conditioning its acceptance on a demand to also condemn Zionism and Nazism. This is what you call in magic misdirection. They wanted the whole world to look elsewhere and not to look at their anti-Semitism. The Soviet Union at this time had been trying to gain a foothold in the Middle East, but they suffered a tremendous setback when the countries they were backing were defeated by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967. Subsequently, the Soviet Union entered into a diabolical relationship with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in order to try and regain their influence in the Middle East. And their plan involved trying to expel Israel from the United Nations and having it replaced by the PLO. There was a sense that if they're not going to be able to defeat Israel militarily, they will be able to destroy Israel politically. In 1974, the PLO obtained observer status at the United Nations. And in July of 1975, the Soviet Union and its PLO partners were successful in getting Zionism condemned at the UN International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City. The conference declared that peace requires the elimination of colonialism, neo-colonialism, foreign occupation, Zionism, apartheid, and racial discrimination in all of its forms. A few months later, at the UN General Assembly, Ugandan dictator Idi Amin called for the expulsion of Israel from the United Nations and the extinction of Israel as a state. The United States blocked this initiative, and so an alternative was sought by the Soviet Union and the PLO. So a month later, on November 10th, 1975, the General Assembly of the UN passed resolution number 3379, which determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The Soviet Arab coalition won by a vote of 72 to 35 with 2 abstentions. From 1976 to 1984, the Zionism as racism resolution was brought up again and again in the United Nations, sometimes passing by even larger majorities. In 1980, at the United Nations Second World Conference on Women, the goal of eliminating Zionism was included in an official document for the first time. So the first step was to declare Zionism as racism. The second step was to say we have to work to eliminate Zionism. After passing the Zionism is racism resolution in 1975, the tendency to see Zionism as the most serious cause of global problems spread from Arab and Muslim countries and third world nations and began to penetrate Western universities. In 1976 and 1977, 8 student unions in Britain adopted Zionism is racism resolutions. Some United States universities refused to invite lecturers who were recommended by Jewish organizations, arguing that most Jews are Zionists and Zionism is racism. In 1982, the General Student Organization of Ontario, Canada, condemned Israel's operation in Lebanon because the State of Israel is Zionism and Zionism is racism, they declared. In addition, they refused to allow Jewish student groups to join its ranks. During the same year, the Student Federation of Ottawa University decided to prevent the Jewish Students' Organization from meeting on campus on the grounds that Zionism was racism. The effect of the notorious 1975 UN resolution was to turn Israel into the ultimate symbol of universal evil. Between the years 1969 and 1972, there were 4 anti-Israel resolutions per year at the United Nations. From 1973 to 1978, this grew to 16 anti-Israel resolutions a year, and in 1982, it reached 44 such resolutions. The global situation changed with the end of the Cold War, and through the active involvement of the United States Congress, the insidious Zionism is racism resolution was finally revoked in 1991. And part of the argument for revoking this wicked resolution was articulated by United States Vice President Dan Quayle, and he said as follows: "I call on the Soviet Union and other nations to join us in co-sponsoring a second resolution in the General Assembly. That resolution will affirm that Zionism is what Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko rightly called it back in 1948. Gromyko, in 1948, called Zionism the National Liberation Movement of the Jewish people. This resolution, the new resolution, would state that Zionism is not and never has been a form of racism, and would have the Zionism is racism resolution declared null and void. And this new resolution would promote and not set back the prospects for peace by focusing on the real issues in the dispute and not on the question of Israel's right to exist." Now, even though the 1975 Zionism is racism resolution at the UN was finally walked back in 1991, the legacy of the Soviet Union's decades-long campaign against Zionism and Jews never abated. Their propaganda and agitation to reframe the national liberation movement of the Jewish people and to associate it with racism, fascism, genocide, imperialism, colonialism, militarism, and apartheid never died, and it only continued to metastasize. We hear the same rhetoric today from anti-Zionist groups on university campuses, like Students for Justice in Palestine, or Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, among other such groups. As well, the 1991 revocation of the UN Resolution 3379 had very little effect on the UN's overall posture regarding Israel. For example, in 2020, Israel was targeted by 17 UN resolutions, while all other countries combined, including regimes like Iran and North Korea, received a total of 6 targets. I want to conclude tonight's program with a number of observations and reflections about today's strident campaigns to malign Israel. First, to paraphrase Hamlet, methinks the enemies of Israel dost protest too much. It's clear that groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad project onto Israel their own malevolence. For example, Article 7 in Hamas's founding charter cites a hadith which says, quote, "The hour of judgment shall not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, so that the Jews hide behind trees and stones. And each tree and stone will say, 'O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" There is no similar Israeli genocidal doctrine. As a matter of fact, the head of Hamas, who was behind their brutal massacre of October 7th, Yahya Sinwar, developed a brain tumor while he was an inmate in Israel's Eshel prison. And an Israeli surgeon operated on his brain and saved his life. On the other hand, Hamas member Ghazi Hamad vowed to, quote, "repeat the October 7th attacks time and again until Israel is annihilated." So who is really committed to genocide? Similarly, the Jewish people who were the victims of the Nazis are now tarred as the new Nazis. Some writers have referred to this form of propaganda as the inversion of reality, because Israel's enemies have been endlessly repeating the canards like this for over half a century. Many people have come to believe these lies. Alan Dershowitz notes that when the Jewish nation is the only one criticized for faults that are far worse among other nations, such criticism crosses the line from fair to foul, from acceptable to anti-Semitic. And this is my second observation. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times echoed this statement by Alan Dershowitz when he wrote that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, but singling out Israel for opprobrium and international sanction out of all proportion to any other party in the Middle East is anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. Anyone who has witnessed the massive demonstrations that have been taking place regularly on college campuses and on the streets of cities throughout the world have seen expressions of fevered outrage. But how do we explain the apparent blindness of social justice warriors to the many moral travesties and humanitarian crises in today's world? In an act of bold aggression, Russia invaded Ukraine over 2 years ago and has constantly targeted Ukrainian civilian targets such as hospitals, schools, and residential buildings, and never even claiming that there was a military necessity to do so. And yet, we don't see massive demonstrations against Russia on university campuses or in Western cities. It's estimated that 500,000 black Muslims in the Darfur region of Sudan was slaughtered by the Janjaweed Arab militia between 2002 and 2006. They were seeking the genocide and ethnic cleansing of these African tribesmen. Most people in the world didn't protest or express any outrage. Over 600,000 Syrian Muslims were killed in the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011 and still continues. Over 12 million people have been displaced from their homes, including 850,000 Palestinians. Bashar Assad employed chemical weapons against his own population. Yet we never saw demonstrations worldwide and on campuses against his regime. Iran's exporting of terrorism throughout the world and its brutal oppression of the young men and women who protested the mandatory hijab law in 2022 didn't really arouse the consciences of human rights activists in the West. As well, today's social justice warriors seem unmoved by the Chinese regime's systematic campaign against the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority, and has subjected them to mass detention, surveillance, enforced sterilization, forced labor, and forced assimilation. There are numerous other humanitarian crises taking place in the world where many millions of people are suffering and persecuted. And these include the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Yemen. And yet if you watch the UN or our university campuses and the streets of the world's major cities, it appears that there's only one real crisis in the world and only one party responsible for that crisis. Finally, one of the most incomprehensible elements of today's campaign against Israel is that it went way beyond a concern for Palestinian rights and a quest for peace. We witnessed a celebration of October 7th pogrom and a focus on the goal of dismantling the entire state of Israel from the river to the sea. But beyond this, Jonathan Tobin points out that we have to wonder, how has it been possible that activists have embraced a radical Islamic terror organization whose values are utterly antithetical to what matters most to these on the political left, including the rights of women and the LGBTQ plus cause. The ubiquitous Queers for Palestine banners seen at demonstrations is emblematic of this irony. These people certainly wouldn't last long on a visit to Gaza. Some writers have tried to explain this bizarre alliance between left-leaning students and radical Islamic terror organizations, that it may stem from the influence of what is sometimes referred to as woke ideology. This intellectual and social matrix of ideas, from intersectionality to critical race theory, sees the world as divided between two perpetually warring camps of white racist oppressors and people of color who are the victims of their power. In this mindset, Jews and Israel are identified as white oppressors, and the Palestinian war to destroy the Jewish state is likened to the American Civil Rights Movement. And it's only the appeal of intersectionality, which alleges that all oppressed people are part of the same struggle, that helps to explain the incoherent cry of Queers for Palestine at these anti-Israel protests. Earlier, I cited a Harvard-Harris poll revealing that 60% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 24 believe that Hamas's barbaric assault of October 7th was justified. But this animosity extends way beyond Israel to Jews in general. The same poll revealed that a full 2/3 of this young cohort responded positively to the statement that, quote, Jews as a class are oppressors and should be treated as oppressors. Although the origins of intersectionality and critical race theory are obscure, these ideas have become the reigning orthodoxy at universities, corporations, journalism, and popular culture. While it's difficult to definitely connect all the dots between woke ideology and the puzzling romance between left-leaning university students and radical terror groups like Hamas, it is certainly worth considering. So after tonight's exploration of the history of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist agitation, we will turn next week to the topic of the Jewish claim to the land of Israel.